This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. Learn fertility awareness from the comfort of your own home at your own pace for a fraction of the cost. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 327. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of two beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today I'm sharing a new episode in my Pill Reality series, and I have a feeling that you're going to really appreciate my conversation with Shannon. We really get into it from her experience of sex education, and it's a doozy. So I've heard a lot of stories about sex ed class, and so this one takes the cake. So we'll get into that. We talk about birth control and some of the experiences that she had, some of the side effects that she experienced, but also the profound shift that she made when she realized that the menstrual cycle was more than just about having babies and that there was a connection to health and in her own personal transition to fertility awareness charting. So really, really great episode, lots of exciting takeaways. So without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Shannon. So I'm really excited to be here today with Shannon. Shannon is a member of the Fertility Friday community, and we connected because I posted, as I usually do, about the pill and different side effects and or other types of hormonal birth control. And Shannon, your story really kind of spoke to me. And so I thought it would be a really good opportunity for us to share it on the podcast. So without further ado, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. It's awesome talking to you today, and hopefully I won't ramble on too much.
Well, rambling is welcome. And it's not rambling, really, when you're telling your story, right?
Thank you.
And so I'd love just to start, just to give the audience a little bit of background, the way that I often do, which is, could you let us know when you started menstruating, what that was like, and, if you've used hormonal birth control, and kind of lead us into where we're at today?
For sure. So I started menstruating pretty early. My very first period was actually in fourth grade. And then I didn't have one again for another year at least, but I was definitely among my peer group. I was early. I developed early. In my early teens, I got pretty painful periods, really bad cramps. Around like 15, 16, I was having such painful periods and such painful cramping that I would vomit. One time I passed out, like sitting on the toilet with my mom for a moment, and really awful, painful periods. That was into the beginning of college. So I did take the birth control pill for a while, around basically from like 16 to 19, kind of on and off. And then when I was in college, I started learning a bit more about the negative effects that can come with it. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle, where sex education was abstinence only. So we didn't have a lot of information to go off of. I remember the classes in high school, the only conversations about contraception were failure rates. And the one thing I remember is playing a game in the class where you rolled the dice, and for condoms, for the pill, for the different types of birth control, you rolled the dice and it was, oh, you're pregnant. oh, you got an STD. And all we talked about was the failure rates. And honestly, a lot of my peers walked out of that class thinking, hey, what's the point? It doesn't work anyway, so why bother? And teen pregnancy is very high in that area as well. So I had a bachelor's degree and was into my 20s before I learned and understood that women aren't fertile every single day. And actually, Lisa, it was year 101 that got me to really make that click for the first time.
Wow. I just feel like we need to pause there for a second.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, as you know, I've heard a lot of stories about education or lack thereof in school.
Yeah.
And I went to a Catholic school,
Mm-hmm.
K to, what was it? K to 9, kindergarten to grade 9. And so I had the sense that my education was super repressed. So when I was growing up, it was like, if you have sex, you'll get AIDS and die.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
I'm not exaggerating. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and AIDS was the thing of the 80s and 90s, like the only thing that anyone was talking about. And so that was my education. But wow, I just never heard of this dice thing. That must have been, it's hard to get over because like the feeling from that, I mean, I was already afraid because I was told that there's no safe days in the AIDS and die thing. So condoms were the only way. But then to add that additional factor, like this randomness, the idea that it's just random and there's nothing you can do. And what's the point? I mean,
exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. It was all of the horror stories that you hear about, like telling girls that if you have sex before you're married, it's like a chewed up piece of gum. Like, would you want a piece of gum that somebody else chewed? You have to save yourself for your husband. Yeah, contraception doesn't work. We were separated by gender. It started in 5th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. Yeah, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. You're separated, boys and girls. And then the big culmination of this program is in 8th grade. They bring the boys and girls together and ultimately show a slideshow of images of worst case scenario STIs and just like fear tactics all around. And yeah, randomness of getting pregnant. Literally, it was rolling the dice and making people go from one side of the room to the other to show the impact of and the difference of you really have no idea. All of these people got pregnant. You can't control it, so you just better wait until you're married and trying to have a baby.
Well, and I'm sure there was a detailed discussion of sex for pleasure and why we shouldn't be ashamed of our sexuality, and clear descriptions of our genitalia specific to the vulva and the clitoris.
Oh, no.
I'm sure it was described in so that, I mean, I think that this is really important for everyone who's listening. Some women who are listening, or some individuals who are listening, may have had a very similar or even the same experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'd imagine that many people who are listening didn't have the same experience. So it'd be easy to look at that and say, well, mine was great.
Yeah.
But likely, again, ask yourself, did your experience of sexual education contain accurate images of actual human genitalia with full descriptions and labeling and names? Did it emphasize sex positivity and even talk about pleasure and orgasm in any way, and talk about how it should be about love and pleasure and expression and all of that? It's just interesting to think about why those things aren't there.
Yeah.
Let alone the fear mongering.
And you saying it now, I never even thought about it. But when it comes to discussing anatomy and terms, there was a very quick, very basic, the same like drawing that we've all seen with the labels. But the only like real images we saw, or the only real humans that we saw, were those worst case scenario infections and diseases. And with condoms, we didn't talk about how to use them properly. We were never shown. I've seen in movies or whatever, a banana and practicing putting it on, and like that was not okay. We didn't have them in the classroom. We didn't have physical examples. We just talked about it and talked about how they break and talked about how one bit of advice, you shouldn't leave it in your car in your wallet because it's more likely to break and more likely to end up getting pregnant. But Yeah, and I hadn't even thought about it until you said it, but there was and absolutely no talk about pleasure. There was explicit talk about how it almost the opposite of that. Like, it's not for pleasure, it's for making babies only with your husband. And even as far as there were anatomical discussions about how homosexual intercourse is not okay, and that's not what it was designed for, and it's an exit only kind of like those terms were used. Yeah, it was a really bad quote sex education program. And it was all we had. And it was, your parents had to sign off that you could even attend it. And in my community there were plenty of people whose parents said, no, that is not to be discussed in school. That is for parents to handle. So yeah, and this was, I mean, I'm 29, so this was 15 years ago, and I don't believe has changed since then.
Wow. Well, and I feel like the one thing too to say that I find interesting, and I probably said it on the podcast on a couple different episodes here and there, but I've experienced recently a bit of kind of shock that a lot of grown-up adults don't know how to use a condom correctly.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I mean specifically that a lot of grown-up adults don't know that you can't use oil with condoms. And so if you haven't done this, go to YouTube and type in condoms and oil. And then there's plenty of people who've made demonstrations where you put the condom over your hand and then you rub the oil on it for a while, and eventually the condom disintegrates and breaks. And so it's just interesting. The subtext of fear is in a lot of our education. They're not actually teaching about sex at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they were, like, they would tell us what sex is and why people do it. And
Yeah.
and also to present the idea that STIs are going to, like, it's like anything else. You want to know, like, if there was any objectivity here, you would learn about the risks, but you'd also learn about the benefits, and you'd learn about ways to mitigate those risks, and also have that message that, yeah, it's possible to engage in sex safely. And it would be emphasized that, like, I'm going to resist the urge to go on the tangent, but I'll just say there's a lot of sexual violence that happens in our culture. And so if we cared about people and people having a safe and enjoyable experience with sex, we would also talk about that aspect of it so that everyone knows how to behave in the sense of, like, anyways. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'll let everyone kind of think about that. But man, I think that it was important, though, for everyone to hear that, just so that people know the differences that can be carried out in terms of how sex education is done. Because that would be one of the more extreme examples that I've ever heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's crazy for me too, because I had parents that were very open with me and that taught me early on. And, I could ask my mom questions. And my mom actually, when she was 19 and in the Army, she had an unplanned pregnancy and gave birth to a son that she gave up for adoption. And, it turned into a beautiful story, but that was a tough experience for her. And so she tried to educate me early on and beyond what was provided in schools. So I was lucky to have that, but still, because of knowing her experience and how it impacted her, that in combination with the education that I received, it was just completely fear-based. And for the kids that grew up without the awesome parents like I had that could provide some context to that, I can't imagine. And I spent all of my youth and until very recently finding people like you and reading books like yours. I had no real education. I just had fear and guilt associated. If I was having sex for pleasure, that was a naughty, bad, awful, sinful thing to do, period. A lot of fear associated with it, and fear that getting pregnant would just ruin my life and completely take everything I've wanted and everything I've worked for, that would be ripped away from me. So that absolutely could not happen, and had to be careful for that not to happen, but didn't know what being careful really meant. Yeah. I,
Yeah.
I and I knew lots, like there were lots of girls in my high school that had babies. And I don't understand how people haven't figured out that the education that we're trying to provide clearly isn't working. And there's lots of examples.
Well, the drive to have sex is a natural drive that you can't stamp out. So if you don't provide any practical information to guide an individual for at least being able to mitigate some of those risks that we talk about and engage responsibly, like anything else, like it's not like anything else, but if we were to compare it just objectively to driving
Yeah.
or drinking alcohol or, the things that you start to experiment with when you're an adolescent, if we provide information about the risks and benefits and talk about why people do these things, then a person is able to then make their own decisions and choices. And if you're able to provide information as to how to mitigate the inherent risks for any of the activities that we engage in, human beings are smart enough to figure this out. I mean, even in spite of that lack of education, I'm sure that there were a number of individuals that you were in school with who managed to kind of find their own information.
Mm-hmm.
And especially now with the interconnectedness of the world, it's easier to find information. But again, what quality of information is it? So then share with us how that, it sounds semi-traumatic experience
Yeah.
of sex education or lack there, like complete lack there, like the opposite of sex education, really. Share with us how that experience then filtered into your choices in terms of preventing pregnancy and, birth control and things like that.
Right. Yeah. Preventing pregnancy was always the number one thing in my mind. And so I had the hormonal birth control, the pill that I took as a teenager when I first became sexually active. And I did okay with that for a while. I knew that you had to take it on time every day regularly, but I think without understanding what it was, like how it actually worked, I think then if I had understood how it actually worked and what it was actually doing, I know I would have chosen not to take it. And I honestly can't remember how I got to the point of deciding not to. I think if I'm not mistaken, it was an issue of like getting the prescription refilled when I was in college. And it was just something that I didn't want to pursue. I wasn't in a relationship at the time. I just kind of didn't worry about it. But I just know that any relationship that I was in until the last few years has been tainted by this ever-present fear of every sexual encounter came with this fear in the back of my mind that it could result in an unplanned pregnancy that would ruin my life. Ruin is an insensitive word to use, but that's how it was programmed into my mind, was that if I want to have a career, if I want to have goals, if I want to have an intentional family someday after I get married, then every time I connect with a boyfriend in that way, then I'm putting all of that at risk. So it kind of just resulted in not getting into a lot of intimate relationships with people, which isn't the worst thing. But coming out on the other side of that and learning how my body actually worked and learning the fertility awareness, I was able to intimately connect and truly fall deeper in love than I had ever been able to before. I don't know if I actually answered your question there or just kind of went on a tangent with it, but
Well, that's a really powerful reflection, because when you have a drug that is suppressing ovulatory function, I mean, when you look at it in a purely a biophysical sense, like how we usually talk about it on the podcast, I think in the world that we're living in today, we all want science, we all want the facts, we all want the research, we all want the hard left brain information. So we want to know, how does it affect my hormones? How does it affect my nutrient stores? And then what are the physical evidence? So when I talk about what the science has said about how it can affect the tissues, so shrinking and thinning the vulvar tissues or the clitoris, and how that could have this effect on our sensation and how it can affect our feelings and emotions. So anxiety, depression, the libido. But in terms of our ability to connect with a human being, I mean, that's pretty controversial territory. I get a lot of flack from talking about the side effects in general. I get a lot of flack about talking about the environmental biology type effects, which are the potential of how the research showing how it could change potentially how we choose a mate. I get a lot of flack for talking about that because it causes a lot of fear, because then people are thinking like, what do you mean? Like if I'm not at the wheel, like who is and how, like, so it's a really terrifying thought. And so for you to have that reflection of, arguably it could be a variety of things, like the fear in and of itself is a layer between you and your partner in general. If you're always afraid of, because it makes it hard for you then just to be in the moment and enjoy that sexual encounter. If there's always this thing in the background. So that in of itself could have been a barrier between really connecting with your partner. You know what I mean? Like, so we could have the conversation around like, what role did the pill play in that? But it's a really powerful reflection that you had that experience of like, when I was taking it, wasn't really able to sink in and enjoy and really just be and let myself fall fully in love, or, and then when I was off of it. So that's a really interesting reflection. I
absolutely believe all of that to be true. In my past relationship, where with a man that I had started dating in high school, and then we went separate ways and came back together as adults, and I thought for sure he would be the one that I would marry. We were very much in love at the time. I was not on the hormonal birth control when we got together, and we just used condoms, which another tangent I could go on about the physical separation that those create and all of those things. But that was what we used to stay safe. And I was with him when I first got the IUD, and a disconnect that happened after I got that had to be because my hormones were changing. Like there's no question in my mind that played a factor in the division between us. Like we, on a practical level, we didn't work out together for other reasons, but the IUD that I got when we were together was definitely a turning point in a lot of the connection there, I believe.
Well, so how old were you when you had the IUD? And then did you have any side effects that you were aware of at the time, or that you've kind of picked up after?
So it's a bit of a complicated story with that one. So I was 25. I had just gotten diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. That boyfriend and I had just moved in together. It was a stressful time in life anyway, between changing jobs, moving, this serious relationship that we had just taken to the next level, moving in together, all of these things kind of happening at once. And then, I got sick. It ended up with the multiple sclerosis diagnosis. And in that process, we were just using condoms at the time. I wasn't on any hormonal contraceptive. But with the diagnosis, as I was being presented with the options for treatment, a lot of the drugs are on the higher end, like the more intense treatment options. It's the kind of thing where I know one of the drugs that I was considering, I would have had to have a pregnancy test every month before receiving the infusion, because a pregnancy on some of these drugs is just dangerous and scary. And, so preventing pregnancy became, and at this point in my life, I had started to learn more about fertility. Like I was getting into the ideas of fertility awareness. I'd found some resources online, and I was first presented with the idea of ovulation only happens once in a cycle, and you aren't fertile every day, but I still didn't really understand it, let alone be able to put it into practice. So with this diagnosis and choosing a treatment, preventing pregnancy became an even higher priority, because, at that time I was envisioning marrying and having kids with this man eventually anyway. So kind of intention scale maybe a little higher than a 0 at that point because of that. But then while considering these treatment options, it was like, no, I absolutely have to prevent this. And with all of these other things going on, I made an appointment with my OBGYN, who I'd only seen, I believe, once before. and to discuss, made the appointment specifically to discuss birth control. And she pretty much immediately was like, IUD is the best option. It's the least effort. It's long lasting, one and done. We can do this, and then you can worry about all the other things. And if only it had been that simple, because that was definitely not my experience. I ended up only having the IUD for about, I think it was about 8 months, 6 of which I was pretty much consistently bleeding. Well, it was basically like brown spotting all the time. And the hardest part about that was the mood swings that I experienced with the IUD. And I had just been diagnosed with a neurological condition where something that can, like, cognitive changes are something to look out for. And with my multiple sclerosis, when I got diagnosed, I had a vision issue and some numbness in my face and a bunch of things that happened all at once to make the multiple sclerosis diagnosis very clear. I was extremely lucky in that regard because the diagnosis was clear, but based on my MRIs, I had actually had this going on for, I was told probably 5 years prior to being diagnosed, because there were already so many lesions in my brain and enough evidence that this had been going on for a while and I just didn't notice. So something that's kind of scary about a diagnosis like that is that things could be happening. You could be experiencing symptoms that aren't as obvious as a sudden change in your vision or numbness to your face like I'd experienced. So when I started having these intense mood swings of one horrible, down, dark, awful day to the next day being ecstatic and giggly and not really having a reason for either and swinging back and forth wildly between those, I didn't have an understanding at the time that could be anything. Like, in my mind, it was just this has to be the MS. It was still so new. I didn't know, I didn't have any context to put it in. So I called my neurologist and tried to report it. And it was basically just like, we'll keep an eye on it for a while. It's one of those things too, that looking back on that now, it's so clear that they started happening after I got the IUD inserted and they stopped when I got it removed. So it's pretty obvious.
Well, and is that ultimately why you had the IUD removed? Like, were you kind of aware? Because it was, in your case, it was kind of, because I always say, just given all these conversations that I've had over the years with clients and on air, is that, women fall into different categories. Some women certainly go on a variety of hormonal contraceptives and have this like immediate, swift, very different emotional experience, whereas others do not. And some then gradually start seeing an increase in emotional reactions way later. And then that makes it a lot harder to make that connection.
Yeah. I ultimately got it removed. Most I think the bleeding and the spotting that I was experiencing all the time, that physical indication was more obvious to me and more encouraging to just take this thing out. And also the relationship I was in had ended, so I didn't, quote, need it anymore. So that made it a lot easier to do as well. And in the time, I'd started dipping my toes into fertility awareness before I got it. And then after I got it and was having the negative experiences with it, I started learning a lot more. And then, so not being in a relationship, not needing to rely on it for birth control, plus the physical symptoms I was experiencing, those two things alone were enough for me to say, just take it out, I'm done. Yeah. So then after having it removed, I started actually practicing fertility awareness and learning in a more formal method, besides just like the bits I've heard and read and YouTube videos that I've watched. But yeah, it's definitely more of a hindsight. It was a small factor, but it's more clear now in hindsight that the mood swings were definitely related to that. At the time, I wasn't sure. So having it removed was kind of like removing a variable also, but it was more the physical, I think, that encouraged me to have it taken out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, one of the biggest challenges for the makers of the kind of progestin only versions of contraception. So that includes the hormonal IUDs and the implants and even the progesterone only pill, is that with progesterone only methods, there is an increased amount of random bleeding. And
Yeah.
so that is a very common experience for women to have when they're using these methods. In some cases, it's most at the very beginning and it gradually tapers off. But you're not alone in that, because there's a lot of women who use this method and then they somewhere along the line, I mean, after 3 or 4 months of continuous bleeding, I think a lot of us just kind of get a little irritated. But yeah, so in your experience then, it wasn't the mood swings, even though you had been having them, it was after you removed it for other reasons that you then identified that, wow, I feel different now, and put that connection. I know one of the things that you wanted to shed some light on as well, particularly, I mean, thank you for sharing your experience with MS. I know one of the things you wanted to share was just how those things kind of intersected for you. So because we always talk about the side effects here, the Pill Reality series, and but in your case, you also had this concurrent health issue that you were facing.
Right. The MS forced me to look at my health and evaluate my body and my symptoms and just pay attention more than anything else in my life. I've been overweight my entire life. But I've never, before MS, I never had any other health complications. Like, I've always been generally healthy, minus the weight thing. So my mindset was kind of always, and honestly, a lot of my experience with doctors that I've had, it's always, your problem is your weight. If you lose weight, all of your problems will go away. And MS forced me to pay attention to my body and myself in a way that I never had before. And so having that paired with fertility awareness at the same time was incredibly powerful, because in terms of weight, especially, learning that after ovulation in the luteal phase before the period, your appetite increases because of the hormone changes in your body. That was like the most freeing thing I ever learned. It was, I've struggled with binge eating. Weight and food has always been a struggle in my life, and understanding for the first time that my hormones are changing at this time, and noticing it cycle after cycle, like, yeah, I'm super hungry right now, more than usual. This is a change and it's different and it's consistently happening at this time, empowered me to not just hate myself for that and not just feel guilty and bad for experiencing that. I was able to understand that, like, this is an effect of something going on in my body. And by recognizing that and removing the guilt and the shame from it, all of a sudden it wasn't as big of a problem, because I was able to see, like, it's okay that I feel this way because of what's happening in my body right now. You're not broken. You're not a failure. This is just the way that it is. And so learning the different phases and different things to expect at different times just helped everything make so much more sense. And, when I'm getting a little irritable or frustrated close to leading up to my period, like the PMS that we all hear about, like, there's something real behind that. It's not a failure. It's not something broken. It's just the way that we work. And so understanding that and removing the guilt from that makes it a lot easier to manage.
I wanted to pop in with a quick message from today's sponsor, Audible. Did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's jump back into today's episode. That's so powerful. You might be, I mean, it's not a surprise to anyone who's a regular listener to the show that I frame a lot of things based on the menstrual cycle.
Mm-hmm.
just in life, because I feel like, and I've talked about this before, a lot of women come to fertility awareness for a very practical reason.
Mm-hmm.
I need birth control. I need to get pregnant, and I need to understand what the heck is going on here. And, other times I didn't have, like, I had negative experiences with hormones and I need something that is not hormonal. So there's a lot of practical aspects of it. And so the practical draws us in, but then you start to chart, and then you start to see this connection between your emotions and your health and your cycles. And so, I mean, I just really appreciate the example of when you start to recognize the patterns, it is
Yes.
freeing, because then you can, so I think there's so much just benefit in understanding the different things that could be connected to why you feel the way that you do. It doesn't make the feelings go away, but when you know that it's related, say, to the cycle in terms of the cravings that happened before, and the deeper, like the more you deepen into that, then the more you can realize, well, first of all, if you know that it happens every time, it allows you to strategize a bit.
Exactly.
It allows you to look at it in more of an objective way. And, like, I'll use myself as an example, because, like, I'll often crave chocolate. If I'm going to crave something, it's always chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing that, it has allowed me to then strategize. So, like, make it work for me. Maybe look for different alternatives, not chocolate, but like, instead of the sweet chocolate, you know what I'm trying to say, though. It just
Right.
gives
Yeah.
you the ability to come from a greater place of agency. And I think above all that, just connecting to your own intuition. And when you brought up PMS, I would even bring that to one additional level. I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's easy to say, okay, well, it always happens before my period. I'm just irritable. It doesn't matter. Like, you kind of dismiss it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's
Exactly.
another layer of that where you could look at it, because typically when like, if you're PMSing, it's not like all of a sudden you're just offended by the color blue and you're so mad at the sky.
Yes.
The color blue, and like you're running, like, no, actually, no. So it's generally things that were already annoying you and upsetting you in whatever way are exacerbated by that time. So I
Yes.
think there's a line that we can all kind of play with and dance with. The more that you chart, the more you deepen into this whole fertility awareness thing. And yes, acknowledge that there's a cyclical nature to it, but then also look at don't dismiss it. Look at the thing that you're upset about and maybe journal about it, so that when you are, if journaling isn't your thing, insert whatever. But when you're outside of that phase, look at it again.
Yep.
If it keeps coming up cycle after cycle, it's something you're supposed to look at. I look at it as like, you got this inner secretary that's like, all the things that you're pissed off at, like when you're in that phase of your cycle, just throws it all on your desk and just
Yep.
deal with this. And then
Yes.
walks out.
Yes. No, absolutely. I firmly, anything that irritates me at that time irritates me the rest of the cycle as well. Just not at that specific time, I'm more likely to say something about it, is the way that I feel about it. Like, it would annoy me any other day, but because it's happening today, I'm not putting up with it.
Well, and maybe there's some value to that, because
Absolutely.
then if we didn't have that cyclical nature of actually something really compelling us to address the things, and I'm not trying to normalize really severe symptoms,
Of
like
course.
severe depression or severe anxiety. So I'm not trying to do that, because I also look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. So if you have severe symptoms, it also coincides with different hormonal imbalances, specifically, typically a sharp drop in progesterone or an abnormal kind of progesterone arc in that phase. So there's also a certain aspect of, like, if it's totally out of hand, absolutely, we have to look at all of the different factors that we can do to just balance that out. But with that said, I often wonder the role that this cyclical process of really this force, or whatever you want to call it, that causes us to examine what's bothering us, how does that help to propel us through our lives? Like, I really question the notion of looking at it negatively. And I'm just really thrilled to hear that in your case, it helped you to kind of, I feel like it's deepening into yourself and recognizing your patterns and your cycles, and just deepening your understanding of the whole process that we're all kind of going through.
Very much so. And I am a data analyst by trade. and a journaler in my free time. So, and I am a data hoarder. Like, I want all of it. I want to track every little thing. I want every piece of information to start with, and then we'll get rid of what we don't need later, and then I don't get rid of anything actually. But yeah, no, it has been so powerful in the pattern recognition. It's not unpredictable. It's not a scary monster hanging over my head all the time. Charting and tracking and just paying attention and doing it for a long time. I'm on, I believe, cycle 18 now of like really charting, taking my temperature, fully doing it, and having that to look back on. And it is a pattern, more and more. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm able to notice some changes. And with the help of the Fifth Vital Sign book in particular, I am starting to understand that maybe my thyroid isn't functioning as well as it could be. And I've been able to have those conversations with my doctor about, and in relation to weight. And, I finally have a really good primary care physician now, the first one I've ever had that wasn't just like, you're fat, lose weight, and all your problems will go away. She's actually been interested in my blood work and supplementing and addressing a vitamin D deficiency that made such an impact. And my body isn't a mystery anymore. And it isn't just something it's not something unpredictable to be afraid of. It's something that I can observe and understand. And the freedom that comes with that is incredible. And the context that it's given me to understand the disease that I'm dealing with, and to be able to, it's not wild, unpredictable mood swings like it was before, because I have those patterns. And if something changes in the pattern, then maybe I need to, have that conversation or consider that. Yeah, it's it's so powerful. And I am just so grateful that I found it and you and the resources that are out there right now to be able to educate myself where previous education had failed me. It's an incredible thing and I mean, now in the time of, a global pandemic, at this point in time, it's even more powerful because I don't need anybody or anything to manage it. So.
Well, I mean, so we're obviously recording in the midst of this global chaos, referring to it as, in 2020. And for the long time listeners, or I would have to look back, but I think one of the very first episodes, one of the episodes I recorded with Rose Uchek, so you could, I'll see if I can locate the episode or episodes and put it in the show notes page. But I remember her saying something like, well, in the event of the zombie apocalypse, you still chart. Like, obviously I'm not saying her exact words, but she's basically like, it doesn't require any tech beyond a thermometer. So if everything goes to crap, then you could still chart. So interesting that you bring that up in the midst of this.
Yeah, definitely unrelated to what we're talking about, and sorry to date the podcast in that regard.
No.
But
it's real.
It is, and it really, I mean, yeah, and a menstrual cup and a thermometer, I'm good to go. Whatever happens outside in the world, that's okay. I'm fine right here. I don't need anything else.
Well, as we bring our conversation to a close, I just want to say thank you for sharing your experience. I feel like this conversation that we had is so important and so powerful to uncover some of the just stuff that's going on in the education system. And I have never lived in Texas. I am no longer a teenager. So it's, who knows what's going on in classrooms now, but we would always hope that it's better.
Yeah.
So, but also thank you for sharing your experience with contraceptives, with the IUD, and just shedding some light on some of those side effects. And what I always say in these episodes is that, I mean, the goal for me with these episodes is to continue this conversation going. the world overall as a whole, and within the research and within the conversations that women are having in their doctor's offices primarily, tend to really collectively dismiss the experiences of women and tend to really minimize the side effects. And so my intention here is to just have us talk about the side effects. Women who experience side effects on birth control, to have a place to talk about those side effects and to share those experiences. And so whenever you're talking about hormonal birth control, there's always some backlash, like, oh, she's only picking the negative stories. But at the end of the day, the majority of my clients have used birth control. So there are experiences where plenty of women who I've spoken to have pretty neutral or pretty positive experiences on birth control. But these conversations are really, really important, especially for someone who's thinking about getting an IUD, just to know that it's possible that it could change your moods and it's possible that you could have some bleeding, or so that if it happens to you, then you're not bewildered, you're not powerless, and you don't have to do a desperate Google search at 3 a.m. to find the answer. Like, if you just know going into it that some of these side effects are a possibility, then it just gives you that ability to empower yourself, right? Like, yes. So what, if anything, would you like to leave the listeners today with?
That you and your body are all that you need. And I love that there are contraceptive options for people. I know that not everybody in the world is going to be able or willing to practice fertility awareness in the obsessive data hoarding way that I like to. But taking the time to understand how, the IUD was sold to me as a one and done. It'll pinch for a second, it might hurt for a day, and then you don't have to think about birth control again for 3 years. If something sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is. And I'm grateful that I had it at that point in time, because it was what I thought one less thing that I had to worry about. And in the end, ended up pushing me toward fertility awareness and body literacy in its place. And it served its purpose for me, and that's okay. And yeah, if I could just give any advice to anybody that's not sure, or anybody just starting to think about it, is to trust your instinct and be open to learning about just how your body works. And I bet you'll feel a little less crazy about all of it, because there are explanations for the way that things happen and the way that we work. And when you understand that, it's incredibly freeing.
I love that. That's a wonderful place to end on. Shannon, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story. I know this episode is going to be so powerful. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I feel like I was a bit scattered and I could talk to you for 3 more hours, but I appreciate everything that you've done and all of the resources and education that you've provided in the absence for people like me that it wasn't easily given to them. The work that you're doing is incredible and important, and I am grateful for it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/327. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Shannon. It was such a treat to have her on the show. Shannon, thank you for coming on the show and sharing your experience so openly and candidly, and for really shedding so much light on a variety of different issues that are so common for women who are on birth control. So a lot of Shannon's reflections on her experiences on birth control went a lot deeper than just looking at the basic side effects. I mean, looking at how it could impact a relationship, how it could change how you relate to, another person, as well as the different health effects it could have, and how often women are coming off of birth control for the physical effects, especially in the case of IUDs, if it's disrupting normal bleeding patterns or causing regular bleeding. But what we don't always recognize are those emotional impacts, which I've heard so many women say that, while they didn't necessarily come off of the pill for those emotional effects, or they didn't realize how the pill was affecting them, and or other hormonal birth control method, once they came off of it, they noticed a difference in themselves, something that they didn't expect and that went beyond what they thought was the case. And so, that's the reason why I continue to share episodes in the Pill Reality series and also the Fertility Awareness Reality series episodes, the on-air client sessions that I do. And it's really to give a voice to real women like you and me who have experienced issues on contraception so that there's a place for us to share our experiences. And so for women who are listening who've had those experiences, that you don't feel like you're alone. So for so many women I've spoken to, perhaps this isn't something you talk to regularly with your friends, or perhaps you don't even know anybody who had any negative effects because everyone around you had the greatest experience on birth control. So if you found yourself questioning your own side effects or having a difficult time being taken seriously, or even a difficult time finding a method that works. So if you ended up switching from one method to another method, to another method, to another brand, to another, whatever it is, and that happened multiple times over several years, you're not alone. And in fact, the majority of women who go on birth control at least end up switching to different brands because of unfavorable side effects. So hopefully you enjoyed today's episode. We covered a lot of ground. And of course, I really appreciate Shannon for sharing her experience, especially her experience related to multiple sclerosis and how her, being on the pill affected that, and how this whole process for her changed how she looked at her health in general. So thank you, Shannon. And thank you to everybody for spending some time with me today and for being a part of the Fertility Friday community. Thank you for sharing the show, sharing with your friends, tagging me on social media. It really makes a difference because this is how the word gets out about Fertility Friday, about fertility awareness, and more women are then given the opportunity to connect with their cycles in a lot of different ways. So thank you once again. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful day whenever you're listening to the episode. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.